Strict Scrutiny is back. Kate Shaw, Melissa Murray, Leah Litman. Guys, what the fuck?
We tried to tell you.
So, guys, tell me, how did this hit you? Did you immediately go into how do we salvage this solution mode? Was it too still just disbelief? Talk to me and walk me through a little bit of how this hit you, this decision.
I don't know that we were necessarily surprised. I don't want to speak for Kate or Leah, but we've been saying that this was going to happen. We've been saying it since we started our podcast in 2019. I said it when I testified against Brett Kavanaugh in 2018. I said he would be a reliable vote. But, we take no pleasure in being right because this is absolutely devastating for so many people across the country. And so I think, for me at least, it was just sort of sitting there with this really odd sensation of being completely and utterly right, but wanting to be totally, totally wrong.
So for me, it wasn't a feeling of surprise. It was more a feeling of disappointment and rage at the people who suggested we were somehow hysterical women for suggesting that this might happen and that Roe would be overruled. I mean, I remember Senator Ben Sasse saying at some of the confirmation hearings, there are always these crazy ladies in their pink pussy hats saying Roe versus Wade is going to be overruled, but it never is. And it's like, well, the point is you needed enough votes to get there. You were always trying to get there. And once you had the votes, you would do that. And yet somehow it was not just the Senator Ben Sasses. It was also, as Melissa was saying, legal academics on the left, legal commentariats on the left, who went to bat for some of these nominees and assured us, well, these judges and justices, they are products of the meritocracy. I know them. They would never do these completely insane things, even though all of their prior work to date, it was totally clear that they were going to do these insane, terrible things.
It would have been one thing if they sat in the confirmation hearings and said, my entire ideological bearing is that life begins at conception and that abortion should be made illegal. And at the very least, you would respect their honesty and integrity. But this makes the court a cynical pursuit. It feels like the Fox News of justice, that this is a political, having nothing to do with scholarship or anything else. This was a desire in search of a rationale.
Yeah. And I mean, in terms of initial reactions, these are the three appointees of Donald Trump who, pledged to put justices on the Supreme Court who would overturn Roe. And he was as explicit about it as he could possibly have been. And then, of course, the nominees got before the Senate Judiciary Committee once nominated and declined to say anything definitive. But it wasn't necessary because Trump knew and the senators knew that these three justices were the product of a conservative legal movement who had been trained and groomed to adhere to and espouse a set of legal theories, which I'm putting in quotation marks because they're pretty outcome driven, right? There's a set of justifications we could talk about in the opinion, basically retrofit around a set of just conservative pet project outcomes. And so that's what's so frustrating about the kind of veneer of law and like armchair history that the opinion reflects. But really, it's just raw power. It's an exercise of power. They have the votes, and so they did it.
Kate, that's dead on.
But this is the one time Donald Trump may actually have told the truth. I mean, It's the only time he's probably told the truth.
But by the way, he only said it to his base. None of them would ever say, they don't necessarily realize that that's all being recorded and everyone else can watch it. But I think what Kate said is something that I want to ask you guys about, because what's clear is there are pet conservative projects. Abortion, gay marriage, now it's trans issues and CRT. I can only imagine that there will now be legal cases that will be brought up to reinforce their ability to censor certain teachings in schools, to censor. They have an ideology and they are retrofitting it with legal scholarship.
I think the opinion in Justice Alito's majority makes that clear. The idea that this represents the triumph of some conservative judicial coherent methodology is just insane, right? Like the opinion itself
the
is
originalists. It's 1860. Anything
it's
after
like it's
1868.
a punchline. it's a punchline, right? Like, on one hand, they look to sources dating back to the 13th century, even though the day before in the New York gun case, they insisted that sources long predating ratification had only limited relevance in telling us what the Constitution meant. In the opinion in Dobbs, they said, well, look at all of these statutes states were enacting in the 1900s, even though, again, the day before in Dobbs, they were saying, all of this stuff that happens after the 14th Amendment is ratified isn't relevant. It's just picking and choosing all over the place with history. It's totally clear this is, as Kate was saying, designed to reach a particular result. And this is totally apparent to anyone who has watched this, because the idea that overruling Roe and Casey is the product of, judging faithful to the Constitution is totally belied by the fact that the Republican Party has spent decades putting people on the court to get the results that they want. Like, those two things cannot really coexist with one another in the universe.
The other thing, too, that I think is worth mentioning about originalism is sort of its roots and origins. No pun intended, but originalism arises in the 1980s as a response to what conservatives view as the overreach of the Warren Court, particularly on issues of criminal justice, but also on questions around racial integration, principally, and it's later the Burger Court that gives us Roe. But this idea that there are activist judges who are interpreting the Constitution according to their own proclivities is what sparks originalism. And the idea is that we should be interpreting the Constitution in line with how the drafters or the ratifiers of that document would have understood that document and its terms at the time they were writing and ratifying it. But the thing about it is, this whole method that emerges ostensibly to constrain judicial discretion in this new court actually authorizes that kind of discretion. Because they can be selective and itinerant about the kind of history that they use. And, Leah just said it, but, Justice Alito is talking about, these laws that were in place at the turn of the century or at the Civil War, never mentions the ratifiers of the 14th Amendment who understood the term liberty in that amendment to encompass a repudiation of all of the conditions of slavery that enslaved people experience, including the absence of bodily autonomy in labor, as well as the absence of bodily autonomy against sexual coercion, the fact that they couldn't keep their children, the fact that their marriages weren't recognized. And so if you proceed from that originalist understanding of the 14th Amendment, it makes total sense that there is a right to terminate a pregnancy. It's total sense that there is a right to procreate or not, a right to marry or not.
Liberty means that an overseer can't come in and take your children. Liberty means they can't come in. It's a form in some ways of rape, forced pregnancy. It's a form of control.
Everyone knew this when they were passing the 14th Amendment. Uncle Tom's Cabin is the most widely read book of the age, and it explicitly talks about the sexual coercion of enslaved women. And this is something that falls out. It's like Justice Alito didn't get to that part of history. It may be because he went to school in one of those CRT prohibited jurisdictions.
Here's where I think this is, because you guys are naturally falling back on your education and your experience in law school and in litigating and throughout your law careers. I don't think that's what this is. This is an ideology in search of a justification. And the reason they call themselves originalists is the same reason they quote the Bible. It's dogma. It's dead people. It's people that you cannot argue with. This text it's fundamentalism. It's saying this text is sacrosanct. Even that gun shit, for God's sakes, like Madison, I think, only put in there state militias because the slave states were like, if you have a federal militia and you call up the militia, like, are we stuck here with slaves, like with no guns? None of this is deigned by God or a burning bush or any of that. And let me ask you, how is this not a religious decision? They're suggesting that life is beginning at conception with no evidence other than that's what the Creator said. But even that is not the case in certain biblical texts, and certainly in Judaism, it's not.
I mean, I would say they keep a little bit of sort of critical distance from actually fully, and they being the Alito majority opinion, doesn't say we are decreeing that life begins at conception. We're just saying a state could reasonably so conclude and thereby prohibit abortion or severely restrict it. But you're right, the deep undercurrent in the case is we subscribe to that view, but there's plausible deniability, right? All we're doing is stepping out of the fray and letting states, and if states happen to take the position, which, we'll reference a number of times, life begins at conception and no abortion can be permitted, all a state has to do is basically pass the LAF test, the rational basis test, and believing that life begins at conception, clearly that's rational. And so a state basically will get to regulate to the point of prohibition if it wants to. But the court is careful enough not to endorse that as a matter of, faith or kind of religious belief. So I think it's plausibly speaking not, an explicitly theocratic kind of an edict, but you're right, it's sort of woven throughout.
I want to ask you guys about the ramifications as it stands today. What states will be allowed to do? And I say this, and if you'll forgive me for personalizing it, but we did IVF. And I don't see how that would be legal. And I don't see how the court could say that you are protected when you do that. And there are a lot of people who dearly want children who won't be able to have them because of this decision, because IVF is by its nature embryonic roulette. And I'll give you the second part of this. How can you force someone to go, if the state is saying life begins at conception and you're just an Uber driver for a fetus, what if that woman dies? Who goes to jail for that?
I mean, these are some of the open questions that the court has basically just invited. One question is whether these statutes even have to make an exception for cases where abortion might be necessary to save the life or health of the mother. I mean, Kate mentioned the standard of review that Justice Alito said abortion restrictions should be judged by. It's called rational basis review. Kate called it the LAF test. It literally just means, is there some hypothetical rational basis we can imagine for this law? States don't actually have to prove that their law advances a valid purpose. So under that test, could states say, well, we think it's rational or reasonable to prioritize the potential life of the fetus over the actual life of the woman? I don't know what this court would say. And that is so horrifying to imagine. And that's not even acknowledging that even in laws where there are exceptions for cases where abortion is necessary, we don't know what exactly that would encompass. And these are just some of the horrifying questions that the court will have to confront, despite saying, we court are getting out of the business of abortion and returning it to the political process. No, they're not. There are going to be other questions they or other courts will have to answer, again, given the immense human suffering that these laws could inflict.
The states where they have the most restrictive abortion laws are also the states that have refused to expand Medicaid, that do not have paid parental leave, no subsidy.
Kristi Noem has a website out now for women. It supports them in pregnancy. I believe it's a robust website, one-pager.
Well, www.governorgirls.com is going to be great for this. But leaving that aside, Leah's point about returning this to the states and democratic deliberation, that's pure gaslighting on the part of the court, because no institution has done a better job of dismantling the structure of democratic deliberation than this court. So, there's just trolling all the way around from those who argue that they're, we're about life. Well, be pro-life for the whole life. And then from this court, it's we're getting out of this and the people can decide. The people can't decide because you've made it really hard for them to decide.
That, I think, is a point that can never be stressed enough. This court and the Republican majorities have found their way to minority rule. Look, and again, not to bring everything back to slavery, but the truth of the matter is that the Senate is affirmative action for rural white Christians because to get them to join the union, they had to make those compromises. There was no idealistic, like the checks and balances of the Electoral College. It's nonsense. It was all done to convince Virginia that even though you've only got like 10 white people for every 500 black people, you'll be good. And we won't let Massachusetts run your life.
And that's the stuff that's baked into the constitutional system.
Baked
But I think Melissa was alluding to the stuff that the Supreme Court has unleashed on the federal system.
They've added more.
Right.
Oh, I didn't know. Talk to me.
The Constitution made a cake and they're like, let's ice it.
Yeah, like
what have these bastards done?
where to start? I mean, just less than 10 years ago, they dismantled the preclearance regime of the Voting Rights Act that required certain states with histories of racial discrimination to pre-clear changes to their voting laws. 3 years ago, they said federal courts can't remedy instances of partisan gerrymandering, where politicians can lock in their power and ensure voters can't vote them out. Just last term, Justice Alito wrote an opinion for the court watering down the remaining provision of the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, that was supposed to guard against voter discrimination against racial minorities. So this court has amped up the anti-democratic aspects of our system and made it harder for voters to register their preferences in the political process.
It's a rigged game. What they're saying is what we did first was we fixed the states. So we made the states have supermajorities, even though there's a pretty reasonable split of Democrats and Republicans. And that supermajority can do our legislative bidding without any kind of a check on it. So we're just going to send it back to them and let the magic happen.
Yep.
Like asking a burglar to take care of the burglary.
Diabolical. And why have they been so successful in creating this bait and switch, hokey pokey, all the different things?
Once upon a time in really the Warren Court was maybe the only time when this really worked. The court actually did some work in kind of unsticking blockages in the democratic process, like the one person, one vote cases, right? Making sure that states couldn't give all the political power to like the white rural areas and deprive urban diverse centers of political power, which they were absolutely doing before the one person, one vote cases. So the court actually kind of—
The Warren Court, by the way, was the 60s?
Yeah.
Or is that?
Yeah. And it turns out to have been like maybe just an anomaly of in 230 years of mostly doing really terrible damaging stuff. The court had a decent decade, and that was that decade. And so they actually made democracy work to a degree. And they would explain their intervening in some of these cases by saying, if democracy is not working, the democratic process by definition is not going to fix it. Because we stand outside of the ordinary political process, have a unique vantage point and a unique responsibility to actually make democracy work. And then maybe you guys can figure out what you want. But you have to be able to register your preferences and make them policy, or none of this makes any sense. The checks and balances, the distribution of power. So that was a minute in which the court actually took that responsibility seriously. And it has basically relinquished any concern with, and in some ways taken the opposite tack in recent years.
Well, now they're just they're on the thumb on the scale. That's all they are now, is for one particular side. And I'll tell you, you may say that I'm being crazy, but if in this case, if a state decides like, the woman who's having a baby is not as important as the potential of that life, that what they're really saying is, to save a life, autonomy means nothing. So let's play that out. We have an organ shortage in this country. Organ donation saves lives. Under this, how could they not go to a person and say, give me one of your kidneys, because it's going to save this person's life? It would be consistent.
Is that person a woman or a man? Like, women don't have bodily autonomy. I'm not sure about the men's, though.
Right. The men still do. But so that's the thing. Let's play this out. How can we make the case that men don't have it either now? Let's bring some peril to men, whether it be, financial or bodily harm. Let's say, then I have to be a blood donor, or I have to be an organ donor, or I have to be— why can't the state, under this provision, say to me, and by the way, the fact that this is the Don't Tread on Me party and the Liberty Party, fuck you. That's insane. So how is it though that why couldn't they just take a kidney and say it saves a life?
Or alternatively, prohibit masturbation because
Now, Melissa, please, okay. Now I have to draw the line.
I think that's where they're drawing the line too. I mean, if you want to talk about bodily autonomy for everyone,
Right.
if you're going to start with this idea that abortion extinguishes a potential life, the IVF does, as you've said,
Right.
masturbation could, a vasectomy could. I mean, where does it end? Or is this really just for women? And if it is really just for women, it'd be terrific if the majority actually grappled with the equal protection dimensions of that question.
Did they grapple with it?
Well, this is really sort of, it's
touchy
every
subject for Melissa.
It's a very touchy subject. It's every
Okay.
scholar's wish to see their work taken seriously by someone who has authority to do something. And so me and a couple of other law professors, Reva Siegel at Yale and Serena Mayuri at Penn, filed a brief making this argument that restrictions on abortion violate the Equal Protection Clause.
You filed it for this particular
for
case?
this case, yeah.
Oh, wow.
And it was cited,
Okay.
unfortunately, by the majority. So Alito noted that some scholars said that there were perhaps equality issues here, and also noted that the U.S. government also made the same argument, but then dismissed them out of hand because the court's precedent clearly forecloses that, as though he had not completely laid waste to precedent anyway. But apparently one of the court's precedents forecloses even considering the equality of women in a case like this.
Oh, so he was stare decisis when it comes
Yes,
to
stare
equal protection.
decisis for equality, yeah.
Uh-huh.
Otherwise, stare decisis is for suckers and precedents are for punks. So,
So they are, would you guys say, forget about personal preferences, is this court and at this point now, the majority of our political system, an entirely cynical undertaking?
This court, yes. I mean, I'm not sure if all of the political system, I'm not quite sure I'm ready to go
Kate's
there.
an optimist.
Kate.
Kate's such an optimist.
Kate,
Well,
come with me, Kate. It's corruption of the highest order, Kate. It just is. It's ideologues in the place of those folks couldn't, and the idea that they pay homage to the founders and the greatness of their intellect is such an insult.
Yeah.
They're such cynical purveyors.
And it's not even just like the founders. So basically what the case says is, if we're trying to decide what the Constitution means when it uses terms like liberty, right? It doesn't list what's part of liberty. It just says liberty. So we have to have some way to figure out what liberty means. And what Alito says is we have to look to history and tradition. And if a right is deeply rooted in history and tradition, then that right is encompassed within the liberty protected by the Constitution. And canvasses history, lo and behold, there hasn't been a whole lot of recognition of women's rights in general and women's rights to bodily autonomy in particular, although the history is much more complex than Alito lets on. But it's not just the founding era. I mean, the opinion literally starts with a 13th century treatise about, like, if a woman, if somebody poisons a woman who has, and the foetus dies, then she shall have committed, the person shall have committed a homicide. That's literally where the historical section begins. There's a discussion of eminent common law authorities from the 17th, 16th, and 15th centuries.
He's citing punishments against women in the 1200s.
When people literally just opened veins and bled out because they had stomach aches. I mean, when you think about the state of medical...
Women were property.
Oh, yeah. So there's one authority that he cites, one of the eminent common law authorities, Sir Matthew Hale, who was...
a witch burner.
Literally presided over a famous trial that resulted in the conviction of two witches who were both widows, independent women, clearly deeply threatening, presided over their trial and sentenced them to death. This is one of the three preeminent common law authorities.
Kate, they were probably sending text messages to Mark Meadows, so they had to be stopped.
In Hale's defense, I believe those women did float. If I'm If I'm remembering the case correctly.
And that's the early stuff. And then he sort of skips ahead and really focuses on the 19th century. There's this wave of anti-abortion legislation. But all of this is passed when women don't have a voice in the political process. They don't vote.
If it's all before 1920, it's meaningless.
Completely. And yet that is the history that Alito says determines the meaning in 2022 of liberty in the Constitution. The method is so deranged, and the implications for other liberties the court has previously in more sane eras recognized, terrifying.
But wouldn't that be like quoting, there's a plantation trial that took place in 1821 where it was very clear that the common law was that Black people did not have bodily autonomy. I mean, you could just quote that.
So, Jon, it's interesting you raise that as a possibility because just the day before, the Supreme Court decided Dobbs in the New York Guns case. Guess what case Justice Thomas cited as authority for his interpretation of the Second Amendment? Dred Scott versus Sanford.
Get the fuck out of here!
Which held that Black people could not be citizens. He's like, see what the Supreme Court did in that case? That's what I'm relying on.
No, Leah's exactly right. He basically, Justice Thomas, like the court's most woke member, as it were, essentially says that because Roger Taney, who is the Chief Justice and the author of the Dred Scott opinion, feared the prospect of Blacks having guns and recognized that gun ownership was a crucial indicia of citizenship, that was part of the logic and indeed the calculus and the consideration when the court in Dred Scott determined that individuals of African descent could not be citizens under the Constitution, something the 14th Amendment was written and ratified to repudiate.
They used the 14th Amendment to play both sides of the ideological coin. They basically
he does that all the time.
All the time. Melissa, I can tell you're so mad at him. Like, it's just like, it's so vexing. Like, because there's no recourse, because you clearly had an argument of great import, and yet they just use it as like Judah. It must feel like just banging your head against a wall.
Here's the thing. I mean, Kate's talked about how Justice Alito goes back to this 19th century and all of the criminalization of abortion after the Civil War. What Justice Alito doesn't tell you is one of the reasons why they're so exercised to criminalize abortion is because white women, as part of this effort toward voluntary motherhood, are actually trying to exercise some control so they don't have families of disproportionate sizes, that they have families that are manageable and they're not like literally tired all the time. And so they're using contraception. Some of them are terminating pregnancies. And it means that these native-born white women are not having children in as great numbers as their immigrant and darker-hued sisters. And people are literally scared in like a Tucker Carlson way that the country is changing its demographic character and it's going to be largely led by the children of these immigrant women or these Black women. And so
it's replacement theory.
It's replacement theory.
Oh my God.
So he's literally citing 19th century replacement theory ideas to justify limiting reproductive rights today. I mean, it's straight out of the Tucker Carlson playbook.
But here's the thing. So I'm angry on like an emotional level, but I would imagine my anger would be amplified exponentially if I knew what you guys knew. If I knew just how corrupt this was and just how much foundation there is for allowing liberty to win a couple of these cases, like knowing the backing of that, what's the recourse? Is there like now, do you take the right-wing playbook and say, all right, we're just going to start introducing counterclaims into the lower courts and try and reverse engineer this thing? And now it's a decades-long project.
I mean, I think it is a decades-long project. You know, there is this idea kind of floating around that this decision in Dobbs just magically happened because Mitch McConnell blockaded President Obama's nomination of Merrick Garland and Justice Ginsburg just happened to die. But what that overlooks is the conservative legal movement working over the last 40 years to build a network of power, to build a network of ideas, to exercise the maximum extent of political power they could, to obtain all of the political power that they could, and work for the long game to be ready for a world in which they could control the Supreme Court. That took 4 decades. That might be the time horizon that progressives are working with. And I think they need to get ready to be involved and stay involved in state, local, federal elections, as well as organizing for that time period, if not longer. These aren't things that
leads
just happen
that
overnight.
movement? Why doesn't the left has think tanks, but they don't work like Enterprise and Heritage and the Federalist. They don't, it's almost as though the right built a parallel universe to they didn't care for what the institutions of society in the 60s, the Warren Court, the higher education, any of those things. So they built a parallel universe. Now they have their own scholars and their own judges. And for you guys who have studied in this, when you see the foundations that they're building, is it like being a climate scientist and like looking at a conservative tank that says that actually global warming is good? Like, is it the upside down when you look at that scholarship?
I mean, it is daunting, I think, because the one thing I think it really underscores is there is tremendous discipline on the other side. And, I don't know that the left has always been especially disciplined. Like, there's so many different causes that progressives embrace, and sometimes they conflict with each other. And, there is this battle, I think, for a kind of political purity. I mean, I don't think the Republicans ever allowed that kind of internecine warfare amongst their ranks. Like, this is the goal.
Mm-hmm.
Roe is the great white whale. We're all Captain Ahab. Get on the boat. Let's go. And I just don't know that progressives are disciplined in the way that requires. I think they have to be. And I think Leah's right. This is going to be a 40-year ordeal. So, limber up and pack a lunch if you want to do this.
Do you think it's because, the right is still considered, like, white Christian is still considered the default setting? It's the factory setting of the country. The left is coalitions of interests of a wide variety of people that have been left out of, disenfranchised, removed from the political process, but can have very different foundational principles that they're defending. Whereas the right only has to defend this 40% of the factory setting, and everybody's pretty homogenous and on point.
So, I mean, maybe, I guess I'd kind of add to that 2 small things.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I would say default setting, but there is this feeling on the right of this intense feeling of victimization and grievance where they feel persecuted by a society, a general public that no longer accepts or shares their views. And that has become something like organizing principle or something that they can all gather around in a way that the left hasn't seized upon, even though, right, the reverse is true, right? All of the Democratic Party and progressives should look at the Supreme Court and be like, wow, there's an institution that is personally attacking us. We should all be able to get together and recognize that. And then second is the other thing. For whatever reason, like the left and progressives, I think for actually good reasons, are less comfortable with the kind of authoritarian top-down approach that the right uses, where you have, the right being okay outsourcing judicial selection to the Federalist Society, and the Federalist Society just picking like the craziest white guys to nominate to the federal bench. And that would never fly on, the left for, again, totally understandable reasons. But I think a desire to accomplish multiple goals and not be autocratic, right, will undermine the efficiency with which the left can just do burn everything to the ground approach.
Right. If your political coalition is monomaniacally focused on one thing, and honestly, Roe has been that one thing for 30 years probably for that political and legal
guns
coalition.
As well.
Guns too. But if I have to choose one, I think Roe. The white whale is Roe. And I think there's an enormous question of what, having caught the bus or the whale or whatever your metaphor, what happens next for that political coalition. But I guess, at least in the immediate, they're just going to keep pushing, because overturning Roe just is
I'll tell you what happens next. They start invoking the RICO Act on data of pregnant women and doctors that are going to do abortions and abortion pills, and they treat this like a criminal conspiracy.
That's just a sideline, though, John. I mean, the real next thing is going to be contraception and same-sex marriage. I mean, it's in their platform. There are many whales to spear here, and now that the dogma has caught the car, there's time to go after some of these other ones.
Did you just think of that?
I did.
That's top-notch work right there. The dogma caught the car. Come on.
I'm coming for your job, John. Coming for your job.
So your feeling is like they really are now, they're going to try and catch as many whales as they can in this. But at a certain point, doesn't popular opinion catch up at some point? I mean, you're talking about policies that are almost, for a divided country, at ridiculously high approval ratings, like, contraception and same-sex marriage and interracial marriage. Like, if that's what they're going for.
Not that one, because that one's personal, John. That's personal. Clarence has to go home to Ginny. So
on this point about whether they're going to come for contraception and marriage equality in light of popular support for them, I think this gets back to the concerns about minority rule in this country, given that the Constitution has skewed our political systems to allow minorities to take control, given that the court has allowed states to continue to have politicians who stay in power while suppressing votes and gerrymandering districts. That does limit the extent to which politicians and the court would face pushback for enacting these policies. And I mean, we're already kind of seeing this. Melissa mentioned, the 2016 Republican platform promised to appoint justices, not just who would overrule Roe, but also who would overrule Obergefell. We're already seeing some politicians express an interest in pursuing that goal. We're already seeing states vow to criminalize certain forms of contraception, whether it's IUDs or the morning after pill. And so all of the promises in the majority about don't worry about these other rights ring super hollow, given that the court just undermined the basis for those rights too.
How is this not then separation of church and state? Because none of this has any reality to it other than in some sort of perverse religious thought. None of it.
Who's going to tell him, Leah?
Oh boy.
It's so funny you mentioned the separation of church and state, John.
Should I just leave? Should I just go?
Over the last 2 weeks, the court has basically read that out of the Constitution too. So it overruled Establishment Clause cases that said, government can't endorse religion. It overruled the cases that said governments must have a secular purpose in adopting legislation. It ruled that attempting to maintain some separation between church and state did not allow a state to refuse to fund religious education in public schools. It turns out that the original meaning of the Constitution is there's no establishment clause at all.
Right. The basis of the separation of church and state is, right, the part of the First Amendment we know is the establishment clause. That clause, it turns out, is actually unconstitutional, even though it's in the Constitution. Didn't know that was possible. The court has just told us.
So the first one is for shit, but the second one really.
Oh, yeah.
Guys, and I'm not going to ask for give me some hope here. Come on, guys, because I know Kate's an optimist, but we're all going down the thing.
Yeah.
Give me a strategy. What's the beginnings of a recapturing of a plan of action?
State courts actually are an important next frontier. The U.S. Constitution right now, as construed by this Supreme Court, is not going to be a font of a lot of rights and protections. But every state has its own constitution, and every state's courts construes that state's constitution.
We're going to be the EU. We're going to be the EU.
It's possible.
What groups would you say to go? Top line is probably what? Planned Parenthood in terms of just protecting women who are in this situation right now.
I would also say abortion funds, as well as smaller local clinics that might be opening in some places that will cater to women who are now in reproductive deserts. So abortion funds are super important, as are smaller clinics in areas. And the other thing I would just add is, if you think about all the things you do in your life, they're basically all opportunities for organization, right? Like, I'm on a swim team, I have a book club, right? These are all opportunities to build networks with people, to get them involved in politics, to get them to care, to get them to stay active. We need to focus on that kind of organization and getting everyone we know, and those we don't, involved in this long-term fight.
Who's got the macro view? Because my experience in these types of fights is that there are a lot of really good, really dedicated people, oftentimes, though, fighting in fiefdoms that are not necessarily coordinated or working together, and that apart, they're very easily parried. But when they begin to organize in a more global way, in a more macro way, it becomes a lot harder to walk away from.
I think that's definitely right. I think for the conservatives, the Republican Party and some of these sort of major institutions behind the Republican Party served that purpose in getting them organized and on the same page about what their goals were and how they would achieve them. And, it'd be nice to see the Democrats sort of take the lead in doing that. I don't know whether that's going to be possible given the sort of big tent composition and the divisions within. But, I will say this, and it sounds small bore and it completely is undermined by everything we just talked about, but I do think it's really important for people to vote and to understand that voting isn't like waving a magic wand and, you go to the polls and you cast your vote and suddenly student loan forgiveness happens. Like, you may have to vote in successive elections over and over again, taking your hits for years, the way the Republicans did, before you actually realize the kinds of gains that they did. They didn't really begin to get real purchase on this until the Tea Party. I mean, and they had some small wins, but like it really was in sort of the response to Barack Obama that they kind of came together.
I just want to underscore, like, the Republicans went to the polls to get justices who would overrule Roe. And, a first time they got Justice David Souter. Another time they got Justice Anthony Kennedy. Neither of those justices overruled Roe. Their response wasn't, I'm never going to vote again. Fuck the Republican Party, right? You guys are a bunch of pro-choice losers. It was to keep voting and to keep pressuring the party to be more hard line on the appointment of federal judges and the issue of abortion. That is the model that progressives need to understand, not to throw up your hands because you didn't get what you want out of the Democratic Party this go round.
Right.
Not to be selfish, but I do worry that, the progressive benefactors are giving to organizations that are meant to be a substitute for exercising political power, rather than giving to organizations that are designed to get progressives and Democrats political power. Like, that is where we need this money to go now, to the organizations designed to elect progressive candidates, to the organizations that are promoting progressive thought in different media on different channels. That's where we need the support.